We are recording. All right, we're here for the deliberation in CBA 22034, consolidated with CBA 22035, starting with 034. This is an appeal of a director of EPS letter approving a forest buffer variance with conditions. The appeal of this approval in accordance with BCC 33-3106A1 to allow 650-foot reduction of the 25-foot residential building setback to forest buffer easement, construct a portion of a 3-bedroom single-family dwelling resulting in setback no closer than 12 feet from this easement to one corner of the house and 2 lots, 3 of a 1968 subdivision of Lot 11, Ruxton Hills, and a 2-car garage on the opposite side of dwelling is proposed along with a driveway, septic reserve, stormwater management facilities on 0.8 of a 2.8-acre property. None of the structures would directly impact the forest buffer easement or its setback. Additionally, we have the 22035, which is the appeal of a director's approval of a forest conservation variance in accordance with BCC 3-6-116D and E to authorize removal or a significant impact to 12 of 31 specimen tulip populars rooted on site, all in good condition, in order to construct a 3-bedroom single-family dwelling, the same as previously stated before. Okay, it also provide sewer disposal as well as an environmental site design of 100-year stormwater management, 2.8 of the 2.8 acres entirely forested area. And this is Consuelo, Amat, and Louis Hakim at 1903 Eastland Road, Baltimore, Maryland, 21204. So we basically have 2 matters that have been briefed by both petitioners and protestants. During the hearing, we heard the testimony from one of the petitioners. We heard a testimony from the protestant, Ms. Kane. We heard the expert from the petitioners, Mr. Leary, as well as Mr. Coolis from Baltimore County Depths, who's also an expert. The expert testimony was limited only to the protestant side. There was this lay testimony that was offered on behalf of the protestants. So folks, if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of go backwards and start with 035, which is the forest conservation variance, basically dealing with specimen trees of 33-6-116. The reason I start with this one is because it has some statutory definitions that are easier for us to follow, I believe, and we can make a determination about it. We were provided with the statutory information of 33-6-116D, unwarranted hardship. For a finding of unwarranted hardship, the applicant must show. There are 3 things listed. The number 2 after the semicolon has an or, which has been interpreted by the petitioners, meaning one of the 3. I think there's a contradiction on the other side of what that means. And then there's what's called other findings, the additional findings required if you make it through that part where you have an and after the semicolon in number 2, which leads to the inferences that you have to have all of the above. So in the petitioner's brief dealing with the first part under subsection D, the petitioner claims even if it was read to include all 3 of those factors from unwarranted hardship, they argue that they have all 3. So I guess the first question to the both of you, if you concur that it's a one of the 3 out of D or all 3. And I'll start, Mr. Pennington, what's your thoughts on that one?
I mean, it has the or in there. So my thought is that it's one of the 3.
I concur. What about you, Ms. Bernardi?
Yeah, I agree with both of you.
Okay, so we're at least speaking the same language. interesting to note is that it's often confusing in these type of hearings when we have letter appeals, because they are de novo. And there's also often confusion that we're trying to see whether or not these county folks were within their discretion to do what they did. That is not what we're doing. We are actually sitting in the shoes of those who made the decision below. So it's a clean slate with information provided to us. I say that with a caveat too, because at the same time, just to confuse things further, we always have the Marzullo v. Call case that says that we're to give sort of deference to the county experts who do this stuff, because in case we don't, but the ultimate decision is ours. So I've always interpreted to say this: when we have testimony from the county, we can give it weight and some deference, but the ultimate decision is in fact ours. So that's just something just to keep straight. Sometimes it's confusing, but I like to put that out there. And the reason I put that out there is that though we've been doing this for a little bit of time, I can't say that I'm an expert on how the county views some of these environmental situations. So I have to give some deference to the folks who do them. To me, that makes Mr. Coolis a very interesting witness, because often when we have these, letter appeals, we don't have someone walking us through their thoughts. I found Mr. Coolis to be incredibly knowledgeable and also, credible, and the way he discussed these factors, and the determinations that were made by him and Mr. Leary the same in dealing with the first three, that we have at least one of these three factors to equal unwarranted hardship as defined by the statute. I defer to petitioner's brief in the record also as to the determination of these factors. And also something that's very helpful for me, if you went back into the record and read over the December 21st, 21 letter from Mr. Coolis to Mr. Leary discussing those situations. So for me, as to that first step, I'm satisfied that one of them, at least, if not all, have been satisfied to move us on to subsection E. Mr. Pennington, any thoughts on that, sir?
I agree with you.
Ms. Bernardi?
I concur as well, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So I guess that means the next thing would be the additional findings to be required. Again, these additional findings, which have the and, meaning all three, there was, and I'll throw this out there again, and not to mean that expert versus no expert means always expert wins, because we can always choose to disregard completely the testimony of an expert. That's just in keeping with what we're allowed to do in judging credibility of the witnesses. But in this case, there was no expert as to these findings on the other side. So as the testimony presented by the two experts on the protestant side, there isn't much, there was no one contradicting it other than an argument, I guess you could say, by protestants' counsel. So going to subsection E, I believe the testimony that was present on the record, that was undisputed by another expert, that the conditions, the additional findings of subsection E have been found as well. And I could take the time to go through all the facts, but we will be doing that. But I will defer to the facts that were presented to us. And I believe that a record has been established. And I give credibility to the experts who testified. Mr. Pennington, any thoughts on that matter, sir? I think you're muted, sir. Brian, you're
I'm
muted.
sorry. Again, Mr. Belt, I do agree with you.
Okay.
Same.
All right. Well, let's go back to the first one. And this definition of a forest buffer, we find this is the forest buffer variance defined at BCC 33-3101H is the definition. I thought during the hearing it came out, and it was good to note that the forest buffer variance is kind of mislabeled because it's not really a forest buffer, it's a stream buffer. It's a buffer from a stream, I guess, where you have buffer up to it. Factually, there was, it was pointed out by the petitioners that the requested variance in this case was infringement into the setback from the buffer, but not the buffer itself. That point was made, and the protestants in their brief made the very valid point that that is true, but you still need a variance, so it doesn't really matter. Though it's nice, it doesn't carry the day or really sway one way or the other. It's basically a variance is still required. In this matter, the confusion or the mud, at least for me, is that we have the zoning variances under, I think it's with 307, where we deal with the uniqueness situation, and then we deal with the hardship or the practical difficulty. And then over on this side, we have an analysis that deals with the unwarranted hardship and the practical difficulty. The argument from the protestants is that just because you want something doesn't make it practical difficulty, meaning that you don't get to get around a statute restriction just because you would like for it not to be there. So unlike what we just did with the trees that gave us a checklist of things to define an unwarranted hardship, again, now we're left in this situation with what is meant by these two terms. Before I talk further on that, I just want to make sure that's an agreement with you two, if that's where we are and what we need to discuss. Mr. Pennington, do you see that as the issue we're discussing?
I do. Yep.
Ms. Bernardi? Okay. You're muted. You're still muted. But I can read your lips. So it's okay. So
Sorry about that.
that's okay. That's okay. So for me, one thing that I thought about is,
Now, I'm sorry, you're muted, Mr. Chair.
am I muted?
No, you're not.
Am I okay now?
Yes, you're okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. I'm sorry. Trying to define the term, I guess protestants make the point that they make the example of this, someone, if they needed some sort of disabled person, needed a ramp or something, couldn't do it, that would be more of a hardship, while the petitioners are basically discussing hardship. And if you look at the letter, basically, when we get into this in a minute too, with the alternative analysis, the testimony that basically strict application of the code would basically come up with a house that was inconsistent with the character of the neighborhood, meaning that things would have to be switched around to make it a much smaller structure. Though it's not applicable here, other than for language, I went back and really read Cromwell again, not saying that Cromwell applies, but trying to get a more concise definition of what would be the hardship or the practical difficulty. The problem with Cromwell is that Cromwell pretty much got knocked out of the park on the uniqueness factor. So it's really short shrift when going back to what the practical difficulty part is. Anyway, so rather than me chat about my thoughts on it first, I am going to I'll go Ms. Bernardi, see if you have thoughts on whether we have seen practical difficulty or unwarranted hardship in what has been testified to by the petitioner and their experts.
I found that they did present testimony in support of an argument of the unwarranted hardship issue. I know that DAPS asked for them to submit alternatives to for that alternative analysis, and as you mentioned before, it's de novo, but I do believe that I wanted to give weight to the fact that DAPS considered those alternatives and found that what was proposed is sufficient in order to grant this variance, because as you mentioned, those alternatives presented would change the character of the development, and it would be difficult to situate it on the property so that it would fit with the other homes or residences in that area. They also found that the improvements did not encroach into this buffer area. And so for those reasons and others, I believe that they did meet that burden.
Thank you. Mr. Pennington, sir?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I agree with Ms. Bernardi. You have a 2.8 acre land here. 80% of it, I think it's 80% of it is taken up by the forest buffer. So that leaves 20%. And then that 20%, they have to, have stormwater management, in the septic reserve area and the setbacks, which would leave a incredibly small footprint for a house, which in my opinion, and based on the testimony, wouldn't be in keeping with the community. I think that the plan where the 650 square foot encroachment on the setback, I think that's the best alternative, and I think they do qualify under 33-3106A1.
All right, well, I'll concur as well. And one thing that's interesting, if we look in just like some plain language, we're looking for a practical difficulty. And what that means is application to the letter of the law would be impractical if we were to consider it. So, and when you're trying to find a definition, I don't think it has to be the most extreme hardship, as to say, a disabled person couldn't enter their home without a ramp. I think we're looking more at a practical difficulty, meaning when we apply the regulations as they are on their face, their application in a circumstance would be impractical. That and the fact also, as Ms. Bernardi said, is that though it doesn't carry the day, it does give us a bit of instruction when we hear from a county representative who's an expert in the field, who considers the alternative analysis and lets us know that the alternatives would cause practical difficulty. That in itself too, there's the language of the statute that doesn't always require an alternatives analysis, but it may be requested. So this is not a situation where it was not requested and we're just assuming that there is no viable alternatives. One was required, one was done. I know that the protestant found those alternatives to be wanting in his brief, and I understand that. But also too, again, we're weighing an expert opinion against none. So there's nothing that in our judging of the credibility of witnesses and the weight to be given to these experts that they're not to be believed and given some deference. So I concur with the two of you in finding that that part of the statute has been fulfilled. And I believe we have no further issues. I would say this, that in the Deb's letters, both of these requests were approved with conditions. I think in spirit of giving deference to those who know, we will adopt those conditions in any order that we present. And I believe that completes what we have to do. Any questions from the board members or anything else I haven't hit upon?
I don't think so, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
I think you covered all the issues. Thank you, Mr.
All
Chair.
right. All right. Well, thank you both very much. I know this is your second one, so I'll let you out of here and wish you both a good day.
Thank you, sir. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
All
Too.
right. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you, Ms. Bernardi.
See you.